As you can see, we have a guest speaker today. Unlike all of our other guest speakers, Mr. Gussack has been successful on a global basis. The company he founded in 1955, something like that, is now one of the worldwide leaders in the bearing industry. This man, who has incidentally graduated from Stevens, I'm told, when women were women and men were mechanical engineers. And from there, he has overcome his Stevens background and was successful anyway. And the most impressive thing, he has traveled the world, he knows famous people, he is among the first people into China. All those things pale in comparison to his ability to catch both ends of a doubleheader at the age of 80 plus, which I think is pretty damn impressive. Anyway, Seymour Gussack.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the early years. All right, so you graduated from Stevens. You went into the Navy. You got out of the Navy in 46, 47, something like that? 45. All right. What did you do then?
I went to work first in a zipper factory, where I learned a great deal about the importance of production, and then went to work in a hardware company, that built hardware.
Okay. And I think you told me before that you got it to be plant manager in the hardware company?
Running the plant.
And then something happened that caused you to have a disruption.
Yes.
What? Can you talk about that?
Oh, sure.
Can you speak louder, sir?
Of course, madam. What happened is that we were building sliding door hardware in the midst of a building boom, in which sliding hardware, especially for closets, enabled them to build spacious buildings with more living space because of the sliding doors instead of closet doors, instead of swinging
Okay, so
doors.
pocket doors
Right.
that went into the wall instead of swinging out.
Right, and we were building them, and Levitt was building houses and buying this hardware. And it was kind of noisy, but effective.
And business was good.
And business was sensational, yes. And DuPont, a man from DuPont came in, and they were trying to find a use for nylon that, other than for cloth,
Okay.
and for parachutes and so on, as it was used during the war.
Uh-huh.
And I thought I'd develop a bearing using nylon.
Okay, just because I know it's probably hard for you to imagine, but none of these folks, including me, has a mechanical engineering background.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're all business people.
Sorry.
Explain, if you can, in one sentence or less, to a novice, what a bearing does.
A bearing is a way of reducing rolling friction. You have two rings, and in between, in most cases, you have a ball, and the one ring rolls around the other ring using the balls as the anti-friction device.
Okay, and today they're used almost in anything that has moving pieces probably has a bearing in it.
Nothing moves without some kind of bearing,
Okay.
although there have recent attempts to use plastics as
Okay,
bearings.
so the sliding door, the wheels that the door slid on
Correct,
would have bearings in them to make them less friction.
correct.
And work more smoothly.
Yes.
Okay, and the idea of nylon was what? What was the attraction of
The
nylon?
nylon, if I could use nylon for one of the bearing races, it would quiet the operation of the hardware.
Okay, and obviously DuPont's idea of using nylon for anything was to sell more nylon.
Anything.
Okay, so you have the idea to use nylon for bearings.
But I didn't know how to build bearings.
That's right, at this point you're just a hardware manufacturer.
That's right. So I went to the two bearing suppliers who were supplying us, and I asked them to do the experimental work with the nylon, and one of them refused, and one of them did. And we finally successfully designed a hardware set that looked like it was going to be great, and decided to put it in production. And unfortunately, the guy who would refuse to help was the guy with the lowest cost production. And since it was my responsibility, I gave him only part of the requirements and gave part to the other guys who helped.
So the guy who actually worked on the development was the higher priced guy.
Correct.
So you couldn't give him all the business,
Couldn't.
even though he had done,
That's right.
and he probably wasn't real happy about that.
No, he wasn't, but
It's life.
the other guy was even more unhappy.
Okay.
And he came down and said that if he doesn't get all the business, he's not going to ship anything. And we were very close to the opening in the stores. We had publicity and advertising and promotion and samples and everywhere.
So he had a gun to your head, or he thought he had a gun to your head.
And one of the things that I did wrong was I was out of the Navy recently, and I answered him with Navy language, which was very abusive. And now I think with a little wisdom, I would have said, let me think about it and see what we can do. But I went to the other company that had helped, and I said, I'm under this gun. I don't want to give them the business. Can you guys get going in a couple of weeks? And I'll stay here with you and solve all the problems that you have with you. And they said yes, and they did. And while I was there, I talked with them about the other guy's reputation. I couldn't imagine somebody dealing with customers this way. And they said, no, that's the way he is. So when I came back, I said to my brother, if there's a guy out there making a living selling these bearings and is so obnoxious, got to be room for us.
And that was it.
And that's what started. I still didn't know anything about making bearings.
No, I understand. And we'll get to some of that. But I want to sort of focus on we should be doing that aspect.
Yeah.
So how old were you at that point, roughly?
30, 28. Something.
And how many kids did you have?
I'm 5 kids by then.
5 kids by 30? Your wife was a busy woman.
She was.
And this was in an era when women didn't work.
She wanted a boy, and we had 4 girls first.
So it's your fault. Okay. And you had nothing to do with it. But that's another discussion.
Just hang around.
Just hang around. Okay. So does that give you sort of pause that you've got 5 children under the age of?
You bet. You bet.
Yeah. Yeah, big time. And you're leaving what it looks like a good career.
Yes.
A good paying job.
Yes.
You're relatively happy at the old company.
Yes.
But you take a big gulp.
Right.
And you jump. You hold your nose and you jump.
Yes. Not smart. Not smart. But you do it.
But you do it. And what's the first surprise that you get?
The first surprise is, where's the money? Right. And
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Where's the money to start this company coming from?
it was, we started on what you would now consider insane, and it was insane. And if I had thought about it, I'd have been better off not to and take a job, and I'd probably end up as president of General Motors or something else.
Well, I'm not sure that's better at this point, but
Now,
okay. So a ridiculously small amount of money.
I started with $5,000 in a business which I later learned was the most capital-intensive business in the world.
Okay.
You spend a tremendous amount of capital for very little output.
What you're really doing is taking very large machines and taking very large pieces of metal and making very small pieces of metal out of them, or nylon in this case, but the same idea.
The nylon was not the difficult part, the steel parts, the turning, hardening, grinding, forging, that was the hard part.
Big, loud, dirty machines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now you and your brother are out there and you're having an oh my God, what next moment.
That's correct. The first problem is get business, too.
And first problem is to get business. So what did you do?
Well, I had a couple of pieces of good luck, which is, I think, by the way, one of the prerequisites of success is some decent luck. I had a friend who was connected in in the automotive business. And he made an appointment with me with the chief purchasing agent at Chrysler at that time. He somehow was related to him, but they were very good friends. And so I went to see this purchasing agent, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Let me see the bearings that you're using, and I'll tell you if I can do anything for you." So he started showing me the wheel bearings and the engine bearings and so on. And he came to one in the steering post, and I saw it, and I knew where he was, because there were only one or two companies making these. Were very thin wall bearings. They're now used in robots, but then they were being used in the steering post of the cars. And I knew that he had to be paying $2.50 or $3 a piece, and I said, "I'll make that for you for 40 cents.
Wow.
And that came about because I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew the costs of operation extremely well. I'd spent a lot of time actually working on the machines and trying to get them to produce faster, better. And I knew what the cost of a minute on the machine was and so on. So when I told him I'll do it for 40 cents, I knew pretty well what I
But you didn't have to build a computer model to do this.
No.
You just knew it enough so that it was sort of like,
Right. And I might have been wrong, but I knew I had to do something startling.
right. I would have thought that was pretty startling.
Yes, it was. And it's not the usual way that you sell automotive companies then or now. But he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "It's not going to be the same bearing, but it's going to do the job for you. And if you like, we can go over to the engineering department. We'll talk with them." And he said, "No, if you say you can." You got to keep remembering, I had a tremendous introduction to him.
Right.
If I had walked in the door, I would never have gotten past the 40 cents, and he would have thrown me out.
Right. I'd like to interrupt there for just a second, because that's a good point of, you got there through a friend. At this point, when you're a beginning entrepreneur, you have no friends, you just have network. And you were willing to use anybody to get you an introduction.
Oh, yeah. If somebody could sell something, he was my friend. That's right.
Yeah. And you have no pride about saying,
No, there was nothing more important than getting an order.
yeah, okay,
That truly was a matter of life and death.
yeah. And this is 6 months into the company's life?
Yeah,
Something like that. And so you can see your bank account going this way,
disappearing.
quickly, burning.
Right.
And you can see the open mouths. My father always used to compare it to a bunch of robins in a nest demanding the father bird put worms in their mouth. So you need worms.
Yes, plenty of them.
Yeah. So back to the Chrysler.
So he said, "Okay, give me a quote." And I really didn't have much business experience at that point. I said, "I just gave you a quote. I told you it's 40 cents. And he said, "No, an official quote." So I said, "Give me a piece of paper." And I wrote the quote on a piece of paper, handed it to him, and he said, "Okay, you got the business." I said, "Aren't you going to do a plant qualification?" "Yeah." We said, "We'll do all that, but you get started. You got the business."
Wow.
That piece of luck that started it all.
Now, do you remember?
And by the way, he said, "There's one more problem. This is going to be designed out this year, so this is 1 year's production." It turned out we made that bearing for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, at this very moment, so you're leaving the office in Detroit, in that old plant in Hamtramck, was that wherever it was?
No, it's
Where?
their office downtown.
Downtown. Okay. And do you remember how much the order was for?
I would say the annual requirement was, at that time, Chrysler would be about 1.5 million bearings, which would be $600,000.
Which would be $600,000, and your sales at that point were?
we were probably at $20,000 a month at that.
So you're at 240, so you're basically quadrupling the size of your business with one order.
Right.
Remember the feeling coming out of his office?
Yes, sir.
And
I remember it exactly.
And
Where the
describe.
hell am I going to get the equipment?
Not even one moment of elation? Just right into sheer terror, from one terror to another terror.
That's right.
Yeah. So now you got it. Now it's the oh my God moment. I have to produce all these things. And where am I going to get the equipment? And where am I going to get the people? And where am I going to get?
Right.
So how much time did you have to design all that?
Well, as soon as I got back, I called another friend who, and I told him I got to get somebody to give me a line of credit. And he said, I'll call, you probably don't remember or never heard of the Franklin National Bank.
Oh, sure. That was the one that went bankrupt on Long Island.
It went bankrupt many years later
Yep.
on Long Island.
Yep.
That's right. And they built Long Island.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, they were out there financing homes, financing industries. And he said he had the vice president was a friend of his, and he asked him to come over and talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy came over and sat with me for a couple of hours, asked me what we were doing, what our background was, what we needed the equipment for, and how much equipment. I needed $50,000 worth of equipment. Mm-hmm. And after a couple of hours, he said, okay, you got it.
Wow.
And I said, don't you want to see projections and business plans? And he said, no. I said, but I need it now. He said, well, come over this afternoon. It was a completely different experience. And again, I think it was because of the introduction.
Right. Okay. So
Those
now,
are two pieces of luck.
well, but you exploited the luck. I mean, we all have luck, good luck and bad luck. The question is, what do you do with the good luck and what do you do with the bad luck?
Right.
And we'll talk about some of the bad luck you had in a little bit. But so now you're in business. I mean, you're really in business. Are you profitable with the $600,000 order from Chrysler?
No, we had to get more business than that.
Okay. So what did you do? Now you at this point, before the Chrysler deal, it's you and your brother and some employees on the line.
And my wife.
And your wife. Okay. So she wasn't just taking care of the kids.
She was doing the books and reading people.
That's right. In the old days when it was hard to do the books because there weren't computers.
That's right.
So, how much selling experience did you have?
None.
You'd been an inside guy your entire life?
Yes.
Okay. How was that process? How was the process of, I've got to go out and meet a stranger and persuade him to give me lots of money?
Well, it's scary before you do it. It is scary.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember Joe Penner and that bit he used to do about, he was a door-to-door salesman and he would build up why this person will not buy it before he knocks on the door.
Yeah.
And so I did a lot of that, there's no reason for me to go because they'll never buy it.
Right. You can talk yourself out of almost anything.
But if you force yourself, you have to do it.
Right. Did you find eventually that you enjoyed it?
Yeah, I like it. I
Yeah.
like it very much, especially when it looks impossible.
You like the challenge?
I like that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if there's a need, there's a way to get that need. It may be lower cost, it may be a better design, it may be something you bring to the table, but there's a way to do it.
Right. So it's not for you, it's not about selling technique, about, the Dale Carnegie schools of how to sell somebody. It's about figuring out what the customer needs and how you can meet that need.
I think that's the key. Find out what it is that will drive them.
And so really what I'm hearing you say is that you talk to your customer and you listen to them.
Oh yeah, you better listen.
Because they know what they need.
Yes.
And if you're bright and you listen and you're willing to learn a little bit, they'll tell you what you have to do to get the job.
Yes.
But you have to do all those things, and it's hard to do. Yeah.
You got to expose yourself.
You got to expose yourself, and you got to get out there. Okay. So, you're not out of the woods yet, but you can sort of see the end of the tunnel at this point? Beginning of the end of the tunnel. So, but there's never a time when you just go, I've made it.
No, but I started early hiring young guys, preferably engineering students, who wanted to be salespeople and putting them in the plant. I decided that if you didn't know how it's made, and you didn't know what the sweat is to make a product, because it's a big, difficult job. If you don't know that, you can't sell the product.
Right.
Unless the company has such advantages and such a product that the guy cannot refuse you.
Right.
But otherwise, you got to know something about what goes into the product to sell it. And so I hired guys and put them in the factory for 3 months. They had to be in the factory. And then I put them out in a territory like Rhode Island, where the chances are they weren't going to sell anything. But they get their knocks. And I think we built a good bunch of guys.
Yeah.
And there's one story.
Please.
Which I tell you, which
Please.
is interesting to me anyway. One guy who turned out to be the best salesman ever for us and then for himself came to me after about 2 weeks in the shop, and he said, "Look, I got a degree. I know what the heck's going on. I know how this stuff is made. Why should I waste 3 months in the shop and before I can go out and really sell? That's what I'm here for." So I remember what I said. I said, "Chucky, most people at the age of 18 or 17 have 4, 5, 6, 7 years to grow up and mature. But you have 5 minutes. So you've got to do it now. You go up, mature, and go back to work."
And he did.
And he did, and he became the best. Obviously, it was more than his time in the shop.
Sure.
He had the right music.
Obviously, but the whole idea of really knowing your product.
Absolutely.
And if you think about it, the only reason you were able to sell the Chrysler guy was A, because you got the introduction, but B, because you knew your product so well, you were able to say,
yes,
I can't do it, I can't duplicate it for 40 cents, but I can do everything you need to have done for 40 cents.
Right.
And if you didn't have a shop kind of a background, that would have been very hard for you to do.
that was critical.
Yeah. Okay, so let's sort of move forward a little bit. And I guess you made a bet the company kind of decision with the bearing plant from GM.
That was much later.
Much later? Okay, all right.
What I'm talking about now is in the 50s.
All right.
And the GM plant was 87.
Okay, so let's sort of look at, I've skipped over a couple of, what's a decade here, a decade there.
At this stage.
They all sort of merge together. But what was, so now you've got a business which is at least supporting itself. And I don't know what your tastes are, but at least supporting you, keeping everybody fed and keeping the mortgage paid and, and that sort of thing. Why didn't you just stop there?
I guess if you got a competitive nature, you can't stop anywhere.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And, I don't know why I didn't stop there.
I'm always reminded, you remember L.L. Bean,
Yes.
the guy who started the catalog.
Yes.
And he ran a department store in Maine. And his son-in-law, who had an MBA from Harvard and was very ambitious, came to him and said, "You ought to start selling stuff through the mail." And the old man looked at him and he said, "Well, that's all well and good, but I can only eat 3 meals a day. I don't need to expand." You never felt that way.
It's not a matter of consumption. It's you're in the game.
You're in the game. You're in the game. And so you're always trying to expand.
Yeah.
And you're always taking risks to expand.
I have a concept which some people in the family know, that if you start the business and people come to work for you, It's not that they're undertaking a job, you're undertaking a responsibility. And because they come to work, they want to work, earn a living, grow in the job, raise kids, have their kids go to college, and so on. And so you have to produce the requirement for their services. It's not just a matter of, if you don't need them, you lay them off. You do that, and we've done it, but it's an incredibly unpleasant situation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's management's job to keep the volume going. If you can't get your customer, then you've got to find the people who do need what you can do, or you've got to make something that people do want.
Right. I don't know, I know the class has heard me describe the situation, and I don't know whether I'm sure you've experienced it, because every entrepreneur does, of the wake up very early Monday morning, realizing you have a very large payroll due at the end of the week, and realizing you don't have the money to pay that payroll. And what a terrible sinking feel, for just the reason you're describing.
Yeah.
Because these are the people that you are responsible for, and you know them. And, it's not an employee number, particularly early on. These are people you know.
Yeah.
And so, let's get into the early 60s. Okay, this is the point where I guess you did the creative financing and got all the movie stars involved, and without going into a lot of that detail, just because those tax deals don't really exist anymore. That was mostly to fuel growth for you?
Yeah, a business, and especially the bearing business, but every business, has an insatiable need for capital. If you want to grow, you want to stay where you are, yes, you can milk it, but that's an awful tenuous balance to be able to keep enough volume to keep going, not lose anything, not gain anything, not require new plant, new investment. So you have an insatiable need for capital, and so that kind of movie deal showed up, and we got the capital. And as a result of that, we were still, the selling concepts that we'd established of training guys was beginning to pay off, and we could sell a lot of the product we couldn't make.
Okay.
And so the question was, where do we get the money to expand?
Right.
And it just, as you're growing bigger and bigger, the need for additional becomes more and more difficult. It's like a big triangle.
Right, because you're trying to raise more money each time.
Each time you're trying to raise more money for, again, a very small portion of output. So what I did then is I said, we can sell what we can't make. And I looked around at the situation in the United States, which was really very interesting in the bearing situation. And I came home and I told my wife, I don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to have some fun. And I wrote to every single bearing company in the world. I said, if you want sales... Cold. Just wrote a letter. You want sales in the United States, come talk to me.
Because you've got this great sales force.
Because
Okay.
And not much longer, this lovely man walked in from Japan and said, I represent the bicycle industry in the United States. And one of our clients makes steel balls, precision steel balls. And another one makes forgings, unique forgings for the bearing industry in Japan. And we would like to sell our product here.
Okay. And so you checked them out, and
Right.
This is the Shimano brothers?
The Shimano was one of them,
Okay.
and the other one was an outfit called Dio making steel balls.
Okay.
Shimano was the...
Well, I'm the bicyclist, remember?
An incredibly talented and directed company.
Okay. How this is your first international experience at that point?
Yes.
Okay, was with Japan.
Right.
How difficult was that the first time? Well, how is it different doing business with Japanese than it is doing business with, say, Chrysler?
The first thing is that you must understand the style.
Mm-hmm.
You must understand the Japanese way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of American companies got into bad situations with the Japanese because they didn't pay any attention to what the Japanese ethics were.
There was a certain amount of arrogance among a lot of American manufacturers.
Yes, of course, there was arrogance.
Yeah.
And undeserved arrogance
Right.
in many cases.
Right.
In most cases. But you would hear that, I heard a story which is absolutely typical. A fellow said that he'd been with a Japanese company and spent the day talking about something, and the other guy said, "Oh, hi," meaning yes. And then the next, so he thought the proposition had been, in every step had been agreed to. And the next day he got a visit from some low-level employee who told him that they were not going to proceed with the suggestion he'd made. What the Japanese guy was doing was just simply saying, being polite, being in the Japanese tradition, he could not hurt
Right.
the feelings.
Right. Face.
And so he was just saying, yes, I understand, I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. But he wasn't agreeing, but this guy thought he was agreeing. And so in this guy's mind, the Japanese became untrustworthy. And I found it just the other way around. At least the people I dealt with, if they said they would do something, they would do it.
Right.
And in fact, the key to the Japanese success, I've always said, was their ability to say no. If they weren't doing something, they would say no.
Right.
If you said, would you make a such and such, and they weren't doing it, they would say no.
So they wouldn't just say, well, we'll think about it and get back to us in 6 weeks, and they would just say, they would have an underling do it perhaps, but they would say no.
Right.
So
the experience in Japan was tremendous for a lot of reasons. One, we got to experience the problem of dealing with foreigners who spoke differently, acted differently, had different standards, and all our people became very friendly with the people in Japan with whom we do business. The only problem for us in Japan was that they did not allow investment. They didn't allow foreign companies to participate. So you had a supplier-customer relationship. And you could get exclusive contracts and that kind of thing. But performance on both sides was what drove the relationship.
Okay. So you established a very successful relationship in Japan.
Yes.
Which I think continues to this day. Not with necessarily the same.
No, because the number of reasons, but the main reason is that the Japanese are no longer the competitive producer.
It's moved across the China Sea. Yes, okay.
And even before that, it moved out of Japan.
Okay. But now you have experience internationally. Most of your sales are still in the United States at this point?
Sales in the United States.
Okay. And I guess that pretty much takes us through, there was, I guess, sort of a nasty time in the 70s probably, since everybody had a nasty time in the 70s.
It was the big recession.
Right. At least what we thought was the big recession. We're not.
Yeah. That's when the automotive companies lost their empires,
Right.
I think, in the 70s.
Yeah.
Actually lost. What we're seeing now is the result of what happened in the 70s.
Okay. So one of the things, which then maybe gets us to the bearing plant with GM, because one of the things that GM decided to do out of the late 70s, early 80s, was spin off or sell some of their assets.
Yes.
One of which was a bearing plant.
Right.
In Bayonne, in somewhere down here. And you decided to buy it?
In Jersey.
In Jersey. Okay. And you decided to buy it?
Yes.
Risk the company kind of move?
Yes.
Okay, because you had to borrow a lot of money presumably to get this
Yes.
done.
A lot of money.
And what was your plan originally?
Well,
You weren't going to operate down in Jersey.
no, we couldn't because it was so polluted that if anybody tried to operate, they could not have spent enough money to...
Cleaning it up.
Cleaning it up.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you have the time, I'll go back a little in history.
Please.
Because the genesis of the General Motors plant, purchasing the General Motors plant, happened here.
Oh, really?
Yes. I was here on a Saturday when I was going to school. We're here on a Saturday, and Mott and Sloan from General Motors, who were both Stevens graduates, were donating a field house over near the baseball field, if the baseball field is still there in the same place. I don't know. But they were donating a field house. And so, because I was here on Saturday, nothing to do, I went to listen to the speeches.
Just for background, Sloan was the guy who put General Motors together, and Mott was the guy who ran it for him.
They rescued it first.
Right, that's right, because it was Durant who
Because,
yes,
it was,
yes, who put it together, and Sloan came in and rescued it.
Durant is an example of a guy with great ideas but inability to make it work. So he bought all the automobile companies,
Right.
the Oldsmobile,
You're right.
Pontiac, and so on, but he couldn't make them work.
Right.
And Sloan and Mott, who happened to be both graduates of Stevens, and who were working at the General Motors bearing company, I think at that time, and DuPont, who was the largest shareholder of General Motors, undertook to save General Motors. And so they searched through the whole staff of all the General Motors companies, and they picked Mott and Sloan to run General Motors. And they're the guys who saved it. So they were donating a field house here. And one of the people making a speech about it, introducing it, said they were from General Motors and they were out of the bearing company, and that he had, Mott had 20 million shares of General Motors. Well, at the time, I had no idea what a share was or what a public stock was or anything, but 20 million shares of anything sounded great. So on the next Monday or Tuesday, I looked in the newspaper to see what General Motors stock was. It had gone up $1. And I thought, this guy's sitting here, or standing here making a speech, and he's $20 million richer, today. I said, there's got to be something there for me. So when General Motors put this plan up for sale, I thought, wouldn't it be great to finally get to a General Motors plan? So we bid for it.
Okay.
The union had screwed that one up terribly.
All right.
They went
The
on
UAW.
strike. The union went on strike against itself. General Motors had given the plant to the union, and for some silly reason, the union went on strike. And they didn't notify General Motors, and so General Motors suddenly on the assembly line found out they didn't have any bearings.
And trying to assemble a car without bearings is not exactly an easy task.
Very difficult. And we hired later the guy who was in Mr. Smith's office when he got the news. Smith was the chairman of General Motors. And he said to this fellow, go over there and shut that damn thing down right now. And so he went and he shut down this bearing.
Okay.
And we were under the impression that more than an impression, that if we took this plant over and started it operating, we'd get the bearing business.
You thought you were buying some business.
Buying the business.
Right.
Yes. And luckily, another friend, Harold Janine, called Bank of America, I think, out in the West Coast, and they came in to lend us the money. I think it was Bank of America, might have been Wells Fargo. And I remember taking this analyzer, I guess he was called, analysis, taking him back to the airport after he'd spent the time looking at the plant and the plans and so on. And I said, well, how does it look? And he said, I'll tell you what my boss said when I left.
Great conglomerators of acquirers of companies. He acquired 85 or something enorm in a 10-year period. He was and he had the reputation of being the toughest boss in America. And he could make people cry in meetings. But grown men cry because he was one of these people who, as one of my bosses once put it, if you had one mistake in a 30-page report, it would fall off his desk, the page would open, and a fly would land on the mistake. And he was the kind of guy who could always ask the one question you didn't want asked.
Incredibly competent.
And probably one of the great numbers guys of all time.
And during those 20 years of building the business, ITT increased earnings every quarter. Every quarter.
What's more?
No, I'll use this.
Okay. All right. So, you go ahead and you bet the company yet again. And you say you acquire a plant in Jersey somewhere. And the intention is to do what? You can't operate it there.
No. Intention was to move it to where we were in New York State and Rockland County.
Okay.
Now you have to really appreciate this. This probably was the largest single bearing plant in the world. And probably over-equipped for its mission.
Okay. Which GM had a tendency to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. GM was very much like a socialist nation, even though it didn't want to be.
Right.
The guys would put in requisitions for equipment, and they'd get it.
Okay. Anyway, so we'll come back to socialist nations, but
we are, relative to that, as tiny as you can possibly imagine. Orders of magnitude were immense. And so we had this plan, and I think we had prepared, we had gotten New York State to supply some financing, agree to supply some financing, and we had located a building near us of about 500,000 square feet. The General Motors plant was about 1,100,000 square feet, but we were going to kill a whole bunch of products and reduce the plant to 500,000 feet.
now you're basically just across the river from the Terrytown General Motors plant.
Just across the river.
Right, okay.
From that, right?
Okay.
That's exactly right, just across. And so for us to take on this mammoth was quite an undertaking.
Well, it was a bet the company.
It was. And we had to make some preparations. So this is a little side story, but it applies very importantly to this thing. I asked the chief metallurgist at General Motors if he could recommend a metallurgist for us. And metallurgy for me, even when I was in school, was one of the great mysteries of life. Could never grasp it. But in a business like that, supplying automotive metallurgy is the key,
Right.
the key element. So he said, there's a fella named Joe Hu, Chinese fella. He has no idea where he is, but without question, he's the best in the world. So we hunted around, and we find that Joe was living in Connecticut. I asked him to come over. I spent a day with him, and we hired him. Excuse me. I had been in China in '79 when I guess it was Deng, Premier Deng, had said wealth is good, which changed the whole Chinese complex. From wealth was terrible, poverty was good.
Right, from the Cultural Revolution days to...
After the Cultural Revolution days.
Right.
And which practically destroyed China. But they knew what the government wanted to accomplish, which was to bring in industry.
Before we get there, there's a link that we've sort of skipped over, which is why we're not in West Nyack.
Oh, I'm setting the...
Okay, that's fine.
I'm setting the background for that. Why are we not in West Nyack?
Okay.
But the people then the officials had no idea of how to form ventures or businesses or attract foreign capital in China.
Right.
They just had no idea. And we had this thing happen a couple times a day where we'd be sitting around a table with 40 or 50 people, none of whom knew anything. And when we'd ask a question, they'd say something like, "Why don't you take a nap at the hotel?" And we finally realized that they had to call somebody in Beijing to find out what the answer was. And we'd get together, we'd ask another question, we'd go through the dance again. So, but in '79, I knew that that was going to be the industrial center of the world.
Okay, all right.
So here we are now.
So nothing worked it didn't work in 1979? I mean, you didn't get together, you weren't able to...
I didn't go any further. No.
Okay, all right. But just to show you that nothing is ever wasted if you're careful.
Nothing is wasted. That is an absolute truth. Nothing is ever wasted.
Right.
If you keep your eyes and ears open.
If you keep your eyes and ears open.
So in '88, when we buy this plant, we're going to move it to Rockland County. And we have a building prepared, we have some financing prepared, now I have a metallurgist prepared.
Right.
And we took some of the management from that company. And a local guy says, I was going to say a local old man, but
You got to be careful about that nowadays.
he sued the county for giving us permission to build a factory there. He said it was going to bring too much traffic. And actually Dave, my son Dave, spent some time negotiating with this guy. Turned out it wasn't the traffic, it was some other problem. It was his own little ego problem.
Right.
But he hired an attorney and they were suing the county. And we had 12 months to December 31st of that year at midnight to get this equipment out. Now, this is the largest bearing company in the world.
And bearing equipment is big.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And down below in the basement and in the sub-basement, they had water treatment equipment, huge water treatment. You can imagine what a water treatment plant for something that occupied that much activity. And also the grinding effluent treatment and a few other things, the heating and so on. And we had to get all that out.
So it wasn't an overnight move, is what you're saying?
No. And the time was ticking.
Right.
And finally, it was around May of the year, and we had till December.
Right.
And it was hopeless. So I got Joe, the metallurgist, who had been lecturing in China a few years before at the request of the Chinese government to the steel mills. He was teaching them how to make steel, or giving them advice on how to make steel. So I said to Joe, take the list of equipment, go to China, make a deal, any deal you can get, anything you can get. And he did. In 3 weeks, we had a deal. They sent 30 or 40 people over, and we spent the next 5 or 6 months getting the equipment out, and they worked until the last day of December into the night to get as much equipment out as we could. And we had to leave all the sub-equipment down, which was probably worth, new, probably a couple of million, then on the market, maybe $500,000.
Yeah, yeah.
It was, but we went to China, and that got us to China. And then the problem just started because, for example, one of the hot formers that they had there, even when it was dismantled, the pieces were too heavy for most ships to lift off the dock and put into their hold or to put on deck. So we had to find ships that had enough capability to handle that. They weren't coming to New York, or if they were coming to New York, they weren't going to Shanghai. So finally he found a ship leaving out of Savannah that was due to leave out of Savannah. He put these hot formers, which I guess in total probably weigh a couple of 100 tons.
Wow.
All assembled.
Wow.
He put them on a float, on a barge, floated them down to Savannah, barge ran aground. So, it was...
It's funny now. I'm sure it was not as funny then.
I can tell you, the opposite of funny is, that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was awful, awful.
Yeah. Because all the time you've got the sort of Damocles hanging over your head that if you don't get this done,
If you don't get it done, you're out of business.
you're out of business.
Yes, completely. So finally, we got the equipment over, and they were building a building while we were getting the equipment over, and then we had to install the equipment. And Joe was doing, we didn't have heat, and it was in the middle of winter when he was doing it. Terrible, terrible, terrible situation. And shortly after that, Tiananmen Square happened. And all the foreigners who were there weren't too many then.
Right.
But there were some Germans and some French were there. Pepsi was there, I think it was Pepsi, maybe Coke was there, starting up businesses. And everybody ran. Everybody ran because Tiananmen was going to be the beginning of a terrible
Chaos.
situation. Chaos. So we called the State Department and said, here we have this plant. Do you want us to leave? And the guy said he'd get back to us, and he apparently talked to a boss. And they said, no, they want to maintain and increase the relationships with China. And so we stayed. And we were the only ones who stayed.
Wow.
And kept installing it. And I want to tell you what the byproduct of that was.
Please.
The mayor of Shanghai, who we made the deal with, because everything was government owned.
Right.
And so we made this joint venture deal with him. And he became premier of China, Jiang Zemin. And over the years, I would go to visit the Minister of Industry, because in China especially, but almost every place in the world, you need to have a good relationship with the government. And one visit, he said, I was at a meeting with Zhang last week. Now this now is the premier of the country.
Right.
And he said to me, how's General Bering doing?
Wow.
You know?
Wow.
And
Which gave you a certain amount of leverage with the Minister of Industry.
Yeah. Because I'll tell you a tactic I used to use. I'd get as high as I could, and I'd get a business card. So if I could see Jiang Zemin, I'd get his business card.
Right.
And then if I was talking to someone lower down in the echelon, I would say, Mr. Zhang said, you know, it was a pretty good idea. And of course, then if there is any opposition, it becomes diminished.
Right. Right.
So having him interested in our company was very important.
Okay. There's a lot more I want to cover. We're sort of running out of time. So let me skip around a little bit, if I may. One of the things that your son said that I thought was really interesting, he said, I'm paraphrasing him slightly, but he said that you are an idea machine, that you see these things and you think, and then you throw it over your shoulder, and he said, fortunately, he's there to catch them. But
Okay.
and talking to you, I know that, I think I said that you sounded to me like a trader, you know, like you're almost a rug trader, you know, that there's always a deal. There's always a deal. So I'd sort of like to talk about what you're doing with your grandson, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk about Xenon a little bit. What's Xenon?
Xenon is
Xenon, excuse me.
It's a gas. It's very rare. It's in the air now, but in very minute amounts.
Okay, and why should we care?
Well, Xenon is used in every flat screen.
Right.
It's used in the headlights of cars. It's used in lamps. It's very important, and it's being used as a what puts you to sleep?
An anesthetic.
Anesthesia.
Anesthetic.
It's used as an anesthetic and supposedly with tremendous results.
Okay, so how, and I guess it's your grandson who came across this, but how did this come up?
Well, he met a boy from Russia in college, when he was in college. They talked. The boy said that his father makes Xenon and makes other rare gases.
In Russia?
In Russia.
Okay.
The biggest market is in China, because all the television tubes and the video tubes and the computer tubes, all made in China. But he was scared of going to China. And that also comes from understanding, you got to understand who and what you're dealing, what the background is. The Chinese and the Russians have always had an antithesis.
Yeah, don't really care for each other.
No, it's been age-old.
Right.
And so for this guy to be afraid of doing it in China doesn't sound awkward to me. It may sound that way to somebody who says, hey, he's got a big business and he's afraid to go sell with a market.
Well, in fairness, and you're being modest, it would sound awkward to a lot of us in the United States to go do business with China.
Yeah.
I mean, you are A, experienced, and B, skilled in doing business. You don't have any qualms about going anywhere in the world to do business.
No.
Lots of people do. Lots of people are very suspicious about going to do business in South Carolina. So, don't, anyway,
I know that well because we built a big plant in North Carolina.
Okay.
It's a similar kind of problem.
Exactly.
He said my grandfather knows about China, so we tried to find out what it was about the Xenon. We had one of our fellows look into the Xenon market. There is a Xenon market, but the most important thing is that we discovered that the best way to produce Xenon is to use the air supply units that steel mills use. Steel mills need an incredible amount of oxygen to cook the steel and to burn off the impurities. And in producing oxygen, they take the oxygen out of the air and they discard the rest of the air. Well, the rest of the air is where the Xenon and...
So it's a byproduct?
It's a byproduct.
Okay.
It's not really a byproduct, it's an effluent. It just goes out into the air again.
Right.
But the Russians had developed this technique for taking the effluent and sucking the Xenon out and putting it in containers. I say that in one sentence, but it's a very...
Oh, I'm sure.
And so, because it was the steel mills, and because Joe knows the steel mills real well, because in most of them, he was back at the genesis of the steel mills, which is also a good side story. When he was lecturing, China had probably the lowest steel production of any industrialized nation in the world. They now make 3/4 of all the steel in the world.
Wow.
3/4 of all the steel in the world.
Wow.
Which is unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
But because they're making so much steel, they've got plenty of...
They're pulling lots of oxygen out, so they got plenty of
Xenon. So we came up with the concept of partnering with the steel mills. You give us your effluent, we'll put in the equipment, we'll take out the Xenon.
So rather than exporting it from Russia, you're saying we can make it here.
In China and supply China.
And we'll provide you the expertise.
And the Russians have said if we have more capacity, which I think we will, more capacity than we can sell in China, they will sell it worldwide.
So there's another opportunity, I'm going to use your word, which I don't agree with, but luck opportunity, maybe, we'll see, and push forward.
Remember British Ricky said.
That's right. But I remember, you can tell them.
Yeah, luck is the residue of hard work.
Luck is the residue of hard work and good design. And good design. So, okay. There's a lot more we can talk about. But I think what I'd like to do is see what they would like to talk about. What do you think?
Sure.
We got any questions? Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question, I guess, basically on how you were training your salespeople. You said you'd send them to places like Rhode Island where you pretty much could guarantee they weren't going to make a sale. is that sort of to test them or sort of to weed out the ones that weren't fit for the job? And also, were you worried that that would hurt your reputation in the industry?
Okay, let me repeat that so that everybody can hear it. Basically, what he's saying, what he's asking is, you sent people to Rhode Island, and correct me if I'm wrong, okay, but it was that because that was a relatively low-harm place to send them, or was that because there was something in the training? Is that a fair question? Is that a fair summary?
I mean, it's the same thing.
Okay, all right, so what was it about Rhode Island that...
Well, Rhode Island, there were a couple of other places, but the main thing was to reduce the ego to...
Manageable...
A salesman has ego, otherwise he wouldn't be a salesman.
Right.
And to reduce it to a practical level, that because he's handsome and young, and he's not going to sell bearings.
So basically, you were sending them there knowing that they weren't going to make a lot of sales.
Psychological training.
And you wanted people to say no to this guy, because that would put his...
Well, it would be magical if they
Well,
said yes.
but there is value to a salesman hearing no.
Yes.
And there's a learning experience.
And why?
And why. And it's sort of like getting, yes, you're right, a salesman has to have an ego,
Yes.
but it has to be controlled.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And Rhode Island, by the way, was an industrial area at one time, a heavy industrial
Yeah.
area. But it was not a bearing kind of area. It made jewelry and
Right.
findings and,
A lot of woolens, I think, too.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was a big industrial area, but not
But-
where bearings were consumed.
Okay. All right. Somebody else? Nobody else? Yeah.
I guess we're both interested in how you train your sales staff, but when they work in the plant, did they do like a expedited cycle, or did you just put them as if they worked at a specific station?
Okay. And again, I repeat, basically, when you put them in the plant, did they work at every station within the plant in a 3-month period, or did you just throw them in and let them work one job for 3 months?
No, we'd move them around from job to job, usually turning, grinding, because those were key operations. And some might do something else. We had forging at that time, some cold forging, so they would work at that. But that was just a couple of operations to recognize that they got to work.
Okay, did you ever have a situation where there was somebody who really wasn't a very good grinder, but turned out to be a hell of a salesman?
I don't know.
There's one other story I want you to tell, for sure. And is this the daughter who brought the Wharton graduate in? Or was it another
Oh,
daughter?
no.
I want to talk about the Wharton graduate.
Okay.
Okay, you know the story I mean.
Yes, of
Okay,
course.
all right. So I love this story. So one of your daughters,
That was Nina, my lawyer daughter.
your lawyer daughter, decided that it wasn't enough to have engineers, and her brother, I guess, in the business, that you needed some professional business help. So what did she say to you?
Well, she said, the business is growing, and you need help, and I think you ought to get one of these MBAs to be in the business and grow, and help you make it grow. And she had gone to U of P, and she said, I'll put a notice on the board in Wharton, and we'll get a couple of candidates. I'll interview them to make sure that they're right for you, and then you can interview them. So I said, listen, I don't want people who are too educated. They'll be smarter than I am. But she insisted, and I said, okay. So she made some appointments for a couple of people from Wharton. And the first young man came in to the office, and I remember a couple of things about him, and that's what I had told about. The first thing is that almost immediately in the interview, he wanted to know whether he was on the fast track or the slow track. And I had no idea of tracks at that time. I didn't know what he meant. And I said, so I backed out and said, we'll talk about that later, because I really had no idea what he was talking about. And then a little later in the conversation, he asked me, what's your quick ratio? And I had no idea what a quick ratio is. I mean, I know now, but I didn't know then, because I was busy making product and selling it.
Right.
I didn't know anything about the quick ratios or the slow ratios. So I said 2.3. And the conversation went on, and I didn't have any idea why he asked that. So a little later in the conversation, I said, wait a minute, I made a mistake. I left out a factor. It's 3.7. And the conversation went on some more. And I tried again. I said, oh, 3.7 was wrong. It's 4.4. And got no reaction. So I said to him, listen, why do you want to know what the quick ratio is? And tell me what it is. And he said, I don't know. I was told to ask that question.
That's great.
Now, does anybody have a similar story from, all these folks are interviewing now. Most of these folks are seniors, which means that we're facing that great leap of, oh my God, I've extended my college education for as long as I can. And now I have to go into that real world, which when you're a sophomore sounds like a great idea, and suddenly when you're a senior doesn't sound so good. So all these folks have been interviewing. So they know about quick ratios. One of the things I was struck by was how often you bet the company. You bet the company on a number of occasions. Did you ever get to a point where you were tempted not to?
Oh, sure. Sure.
And sort of what was the deciding factor?
I have no idea. There's some gene running around that's maybe everything looks better than it should. Maybe I don't recognize the risks, because I remember what my father used to tell me often. Mm-hmm. And he said, it's not the decision you make, it's what you do when you found out you made the wrong decision. And then if you've got the courage to correct it, you
Right.
can correct it.
Right.
Coupled with that is what Janine used to say, which is, you can correct anything in business. Don't run out of money.
Don't run out of money. And there's a certain amount of life lesson there. You can correct anything in life as long as you don't run out of money.
Let me say something to the people who are going to be out looking for a job.
Please do.
From my personal experience, and I'm assuming the education that you're receiving here now is as good or better than the education we received. My experience in going into the world and meeting people from other engineering schools confirm that the education you're getting is broader, deeper, more practical than from even the most prestigious schools. And my evidence for that is that when after I graduated here, the Navy sent me to Annapolis, and we had a reserve training group which was made up of only engineers, and engineers from everywhere in the country, what I thought were the best schools, Harvard and so on. And I found when I talked with them that I knew more about a lot of subjects that were, or I had a broader understanding of a lot of subjects that for the most part these schools had focused in. There might be an electrical engineer, and I found I could talk with him knowledgeably, maybe not more knowledgeable than he, but he could not talk about any of the subjects that I knew about at all.
Right.
So I think you got a really broad, and useful education. And if you go with confidence, that's That's 90%.
It's amazing what you can get away with if they think that you know what you're doing.
It's amazing what you can get away with if you think you know it.
Or even more so. I would like to continue this conversation. I could go for another 4 hours. We don't have time to do it. You don't have the time to do it. So I'm going to sort of artificially call a halt.
Okay.
And I want to, first of all, thank you for coming. It's been a joy.